My name is Laura Maristani. I am one of the advisors with FreeUp, and I'm also a technology platform founder. I'm building a platform that is helping to figure out how do we actually dive into a skills-first approach and a skills-first economy. So I'm excited to be able to moderate today's conversation. We're not, as with all the other sessions today, I'm going to ask our folks to just quickly introduce themselves and dive in. I did want to say a couple of things just to get us started. You know, sitting in the conversations today is really interesting, including, you know, you were talking a lot today about school choice and what we're doing in all of that realm. And one conversation that stands out to me, coming also from the field developing apprenticeship ecosystems across the country, is that we're talking a lot about different policies that are targeted to a very specific demographic of folks, whether it's the K-12 to higher ed, but we haven't talked as much about what happens on the workforce side. How do we upskill and reskill populations left out of economic mobility for whatever reasons, you know, education obviously being one of them. But what are those different strategies? What are we seeing across the country? How are we going to strengthen the American workforce? What are the policies or not? What are the things that we need to get rid of so that we can create more opportunity for folks to not only enter the workforce, stay in it, be able to grow within it, be able to find opportunity and higher wage jobs. So that, I'm really excited for this panel to kind of dive in and share your perspectives on how to do that and how we're going to strengthen the American workforce. So why don't you start, Preston?
All right. I'm Preston Cooper, a senior fellow here at FreeUp, and I focus on higher education policy. Should we just start or go do introductions first?
Go ahead, and then we'll do intros. And if you want to share any initial thoughts, go for that.
Sure. So anyone who is at the higher education panel will probably get my spiel twice, which I know is just what you wanted. But yeah, I mean, I think that for a long time, we have viewed college as kind of the only route to economic mobility. We've poured tons of federal money into traditional colleges and universities with the intent of getting more people able to afford college, more people going on the college pathway. And that has worked out well for some people, but it hasn't necessarily worked out well for everybody. You know, there are folks who have graduated with degrees that don't have a whole lot of labor market relevance. There are people who have paid too much in tuition, who have accumulated too much debt that the earnings they're getting from their degree don't justify. And there are some people who have gone to institutions that didn't help them get across the finish line or weren't academically prepared for college in the first place, and they ended up dropping out with some student debt and no degree. And so this the kind of the college for all mentality has ended up not necessarily fulfilling all of the labor market needs that we have, because we know the job vacancy rate right now is very high. I think it's Jackson can probably do the stats better than I can, but I think it's very close to a record high. And yet there are a lot of people who don't necessarily have the skills to fill those jobs. So I think we should be talking about other pathways besides college, apprenticeships, workforce training, other ways to get students and workers equipped with the skills that they'll need to be successful in the economy of tomorrow.
Hi, I'm Natalia Dashin. I'm a visiting scholar for immigration. One of the things that I've been paying attention to are ways that considering the global workforce as part of the local workforce distorts incentives for making work a good option for the local workforce. As Preston just said, the vacancy rate for the labor force is really, really high. And with inflation, people are doing worse off. And so if people are worse off and there are a lot of jobs available and people aren't taking them, that's a signal that there are misaligned incentives between the perks of the job, the money being paid for the job, and what people think they can get for working. And not just immediately in terms of wages, but longer term. How does the job help them with their 2-year plan, with their 5-year plan, with their 10-year plan? A lot of people are finding that they have to be really, really creative, switch jobs often, move to different cities. And so as the whole structure of work changes and gig economy becomes more important, for people to buy houses and raise families. A lot of what we conventionally see as incentive structures that have been working are breaking down.
Hi, my name is Jackson Mejia. I'm a visiting fellow at FreeUp, and I study economics. And I mostly study taxes, and so I think this is really a lot about taxes. And there's this view that it's puzzling that low-income people don't seem to support as much redistribution as you might expect, given that they are low income. And one resolution of that puzzle is that if they think that they'll be rich in the future or that their children will be, then they won't support high taxes on the rich as much as we might think they would. And it's important that we have policies that enable mobility just so that, we keep having these pro-growth, low-tax policies in the future. And so as part of that, we have to be careful to not do things like make marginally effective tax rates on poor people very high. So for example, we have lots of income traps where the ITC, when it phases out, there are very high tax rates on low-income people. And so it's important to remove those barriers and enable social mobility.
Oh, I'm David Beer, Associate Director of Immigration Studies with the Cato Institute. And, there are a lot of policies that we can pursue that would get us a little bit further with the existing workforce that we have. But if you look at the labor force growth rate over the last 60 years, you can see continuous declines in that growth rate. Just to get back, for example, to get back to the labor force growth rate that we had in the 1980s would take about 50 million more workers over the next decade. The labor force growth rate in the 2010s, or the labor force total absolute growth rate, was just 7 million people. So we have this massive deficit, I would call it, from what we were experiencing in the past. And it's more acute now than ever because so many of the people who were in the labor force are now retirees. And so that pushes up the cost of costs of goods and services in the economy as they are still consuming, but they are not producing as they were in the past. So we need workers to push the productivity of the U.S. economy forward, to maintain the standard of living that we have. And where are we going to get those workers? We can get some people from the sidelines of the U.S. economy back up, but if you look at the employment rate for the prime age workforce, it's near the highest level we've seen in the history of the United States. More women are working now than have ever worked as a share of the population. So this really, when it comes to immigration, we focus so much on border security, and all that stuff dominates the media narrative. But the real crux of the issue is, how are we going to create a system that lets people come legally in the future to contribute to this country and fill many of these jobs that are open and available? And so the biggest difference, you could take someone and you can upskill them and you can give them more skills, but that's going to marginally increase their wages, and that's a great thing. But when you go from zero, the job's not being filled, there's nothing being produced, to something being produced, that's the biggest change. And that would basically require a major change in our immigration policies to enable that to happen. A lot of reasons, of course, why that hasn't happened. But immigration is central to this. Of course, there are a lot of things that immigrants already here could be contributing more as well if we change policies when it comes to how they come into the country, whether it's with work authorization or without, requiring occupational licenses for many of the jobs that they want to perform.
Thank you. And hold on to the mic. We'll kind of come back this way. So each of you has a little bit of a slice, right? Because this is not a simple issue. When we talk about the workforce, we talk about highly skilled workers that are needed for certain tracks. But there are a lot of jobs, particularly in technology, that don't necessarily require such high skills, right? Or even traditional pathways to a diploma. A lot of because technology obviously evolves so quickly, even the higher ed systems don't have the capacity to shift that quickly to be able to teach for what the demand is. I would like each of you to kind of go through what the strategies are and what particular, when you're talking about immigration, like what are the jobs that we're talking about that we need to fill? And then what are your recommendations on what's working, what isn't working, and what we should be doing to be able to upskill, reskill, and meet the demand for workers at those different tiers?
Look, it's really everything. I mean, the plummeting labor force growth rate has affected every skill level, every job type. We're seeing shortages across the economy. I mean, the number one area that we really need workers is in a lot of interpersonal services like childcare and home health aides and nursing assistants and all of those types of positions. And you think, well, those are kind of low-skilled jobs. Where's the productivity gain? Well, if my father doesn't have to retire to take care of my mother after her stroke, that's a huge cost to the economy in terms of productivity. If my wife doesn't have to drop out of the labor force to provide childcare, that's a huge increase in productivity. So these are things that immigrants can help address at sort of the lower end. At the higher end, I mean, we have a pipeline for very skilled people into this country through higher education. If you look at who's getting graduate degrees in technical fields, 75% of them are international students. If you look at electrical engineering, for example, there's about 28,000 people studying electrical engineering getting a degree, 28,000 international students, 8,000 American students. And obviously there's a lot of that goes into why there's this huge disparity between international students and U.S. students. But the main issue then is that those 28,000 international students have no pathway to stay permanently in the United States, no direct one. There are a lot of different sort of temporary work schemes that have cropped up over the years that enable them to stay for a while and sort of workarounds. But at the end of the day, there's no path to a green card or permanent residence for those people. And that is the fundamental issue that drives so many of them to leave the country. And then you look at a country like Canada. Canada now is over 23% of their population is foreign-born. If you compare that to the United States, 14%. To understand what those numbers mean in real terms, in order for the United States to catch up to Canada in terms of our foreign-born share of the population, would require 30 million immigrants to show up tomorrow. Obviously, that's impossible. It would never happen. I'm not even proposing that. But that is the scale at which they have had a legal immigration system. Almost all of their immigrants are there legally. A quarter of ours are not. So there's a huge difference in policies that different countries have pursued. And we're on the losing side on that.
Just jumping off that last comment with an anecdote. So it used to be that economics was classified as a liberal art because, well, it kind of is. But recently, a lot of schools have reclassified economics as STEM because it means that international students can work for 3 years instead of 1. And we make it very hard for people to do that. And then expanding a bit more on the tax point from earlier, I think that it's important to remember that the flip side of labor is leisure, and that's leisure is something that we actually do care quite a bit about. One of the main reasons we want to be more productive is so that we can spend more time doing things that we like. And we have made it very expensive for low-income people to work in some cases with these set of very high tax rates. But then we've also, in this sort of a paradox of the American economy, we've gotten very good at producing leisure. And so it's far better these days to sit at home with your phone or video games or something. And I think that we have to remember that like we talk about the economy, we talk about productivity, but in the end, what we care about is not only consuming goods but leisure. And we have to remember that because in these discussions, I think that we often lose sight of just how important that is to lots of people.
So a lot's being covered here. If I had a strategy, my strategy would be to make hiring as painless and trivial as possible. There's a lot of oddities around hiring. To piggyback off of some of the immigration conversation, a lot of people don't know this, but when an immigrant comes into the country to work, they can't switch jobs without losing their sponsorship, or they're stuck with their employer until they find another sponsor, but then their applications for either the 3-year H-1B visa or a green card get reset. And there are a lot of odd laws. Like some people can't take an extra job or else they will lose their health insurance if they're on certain kinds of health insurance. Some people have a boyfriend or a girlfriend who's on their corporate health insurance. And if they change jobs, they have a gap in coverage. And so it's not super fluid. There's not a lot of liquidity in switching jobs or taking on a new job. So my strategy would be to, if you want people to work more, to do more interesting jobs, to add more liquidity to the equation and optimize for that variable.
So I did a paper a couple years back on the healthcare sector, which is one of the fastest growing sectors. We've got a very rapidly aging population. A lot of demand for healthcare. A lot of jobs in healthcare are projected to have very fast growth. So we looked at job postings for various jobs in the healthcare sector, and we divided them up into what we call jobs that require basically just a high school diploma, like home health aides, jobs that require really advanced education, so your doctors, nurse practitioners and so forth. And then there's a group in the middle, who require some training beyond high school, but not a 4-year college degree. And it was this middle group that was experiencing like twice as fast growth in job postings as either of the other two groups. These are folks like rad techs, X-ray technicians, LPNs, folks who whose jobs require some specialized skills, but not necessarily skills that you would learn in a traditional 4-year college setting. And unfortunately, the funding streams that we have set up for education beyond high school don't necessarily provide these pathways with a lot of support, even though there are tons of jobs in these fields that are opening up, and that those jobs are only expected to grow over the coming decade. Right now, if you want to go get a 4-year college degree, you can qualify for Pell Grants, you can qualify for student loans, tuition tax credits. Your university is probably getting direct subsidies from the state. It's benefiting from tax exemptions and so forth. If you want to go to a workforce training program or an apprenticeship, the provider is going to have to apply to be on a list, and then there's a limited pool of funding that they might be eligible for but might not because it's limited. And even if they do get it, it's probably just going to be a couple $1,000 at most to train you. We don't really have the funding formula set up to really support that kind of work. And so what I would argue is that we should have a level playing field. We don't necessarily have to say, well, we want to do apprenticeships over college or we want to do college over apprenticeships, but we should have a level playing field between these different options. So we should make sure that no matter, what option a student chooses in order to prepare themselves for their future career, there's going to be a roughly equal amount of funding available, and there's going to be a roughly equal amount of support available, so that if the federal government can be agnostic towards the means that students are using to train themselves for their future careers, that's when we can see some of these open jobs start to be filled, because more people will be able to go into those middle skill routes, those non-college routes, rather than the traditional 4-year college degree.
There's this surge of, I don't know what to call it, neo-Luddism on both the right and the left, which is worried about the Terminator or something with AI. And I think that an analogy with education is nice here because, education is a technology that can transform a low-income person into a high-income person over a period of several years. And AI, ChatGPT, this kind of thing, it transforms a person. You can take a 100 IQ person and turn them into a 120 IQ person, or into a pretty good writer, a mediocre writer at least. And so I think we have to be careful about that, because it has the real potential to level out the playing field between lots of people in a very efficient way, and really could put a dent in inequality.
So I want to kind of push a little bit on the topic of folks outside of traditional paths, right? So we've talked about the high school pathways, even on the immigration side, how we're kind of bringing in those students. But what about the current workers that want to redefine themselves? What is available to them? What is standing in their way? And I think, obviously each of you has a slice of that, whether it's bringing higher skilled folks, and what does that look like from other countries, or as we're looking at apprenticeships and other sorts of opportunities to reskill the folks that may have lower wage jobs that could have some of those soft skills or other skills that could be translatable, but what needs to be done or not done? What is standing in their way to coming into the workforce meaningfully?
Sure. Well, I talked about the different pathways that should be available to students. I talked about how we should have more support for these non-college pathways. But I would also say some of the onus needs to be on employers. That right now, I'll give you an example. So in 1990, only 9% of secretaries or administrative professionals had college degrees. Now that's about 36%. And 70% of job postings for this role, for secretaries and administrative professionals, say we want the applicant to have a 4-year college degree. Well, back in 1990, the role of a secretary, it didn't pay great, but it didn't pay minimum wage either. It used to be, a fairly decent job opportunity for folks with only a high school education who might not necessarily want to go the college pathway. It was a good entry point into the labor force. You could get into that job with just a few weeks of training, and you could eventually, if you became very good at it, you could eventually graduate to becoming an executive assistant, or potentially something that might pay a lot more money. But employers, have started to have this bias where they say, oh well, we're getting a lot of applications for this job, so we're just going to start applying a college degree filter to filter out these applications. And so they did that when we had a very slack labor market. Now that we have a tight labor market, a lot of them still have those college degree requirements, and they're saying, well, why isn't anyone applying for this job? And so I think. While some of the onus does need to be on policy to make sure that there are alternative pathways available, some of the onus also needs to be on employers to recognize, there are some jobs that don't really need a college degree. We can take people who have either alternative training, no 4-year degree, but, some experience and skills, or maybe even just a high school diploma. We can figure out ways to train them up on the job. And that's one way that we can reduce the vacancy rate. We can reduce some of this skills mismatches. If employers start to recognize, well, maybe not every job that we say needs a college degree actually needs a college degree.
I think it's important to, Jackson brought up lifestyle considerations and leisure a while back. And in terms of factors for switching jobs, what you're talking about here can actually be pretty important. I got a buddy who quit her nursing program and switched to being a rad tech, pays the same, better lifestyle gains. During COVID, there was a shortage of nurses. Nurses were being paid a lot to go move to different places and be nurses there, but being a nurse during COVID isn't fun. They work really long hours if you're a nurse, and you don't get a lot of time off, and you don't get to pick when your time off is. A lot of people, when they're choosing a profession, something like being on a very, very rigid schedule, not having a lot of choice about what your life is going to shape out to be, is a serious consideration. Now, jobs like that are desirable for people who have worse jobs. But if you're talking about jobs, you're talking about, hey, what is this person signing up to be doing? What are they giving up? What are they gaining? And entire sectors are very, very, very different in this domain. A lot of the places where there are job shortages are relatively well paid compared to other jobs. But a lot of people just don't want to do them because a lot of people don't want to do them. A lot of people don't want to be surgeons because being a surgeon is too hard, and no laws have been passed to shorten surgeon practicing hours to such an extent that makes being a surgeon really, really great for people. You get a lot of money, but it's still not a super, super, super desirable profession for people who don't care about the prestige or don't have really, really personal reasons to get into it.
So I'll agree with Preston that the onus is sometimes on firms, and I'll summarize Natalia's point as when there's vacancies, then raise wages. Right? No?
Or make lifestyle better.
Okay, sure, yeah. And then on a separate note, I think that, so earlier today there was a YIMBY session, and I think that in these discussions about making the workforce more accessible for low-income people or immigrants, that kind of thing, we have to remember that we make it increasingly difficult and expensive to live in places where their help would be probably be most required. And so, for example, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I don't think that anyone is allowed to build anything at all. And there's one very small part where there's a bunch of tech companies, but overall it's extremely expensive. And so if we want people to come in and work in these firms or work around these firms, then it's like it's just like, yeah, we can have the jobs, but no one's going to fill them because I don't want to commute for an hour or 2 hours to get there.
Yeah, that's a really important point. You got to get the workers to the job site, and there are a lot of communities that have walled themselves off, legally speaking, from new people. When it comes to immigration, you always hear about the flows in, and the thing that I'm paying more attention to recently are the flows that are leaving. The number of people who come to the United States, and because of the legal burdens that we place on their ability to contribute to this country, end up leaving. So just to take one example, the Indian population in the United States, immigrants from India, are the highest earning demographic group in the United States. And in 2017, there were about 800,000 Indian nationals who said that they had entered during the Obama years. By 2022, that number had been cut in half. That means that we lost about 400,000 people who now have moved back to India, presumably, but they probably moved to Canada and Australia and some other countries as well. And that is a direct consequences of our immigration policies that say, as we heard earlier, you can come temporarily, you might be able to work for this employer, but you can't start a business, you can't change jobs easily. Your family might be able to stay temporarily, but if your kid who comes along with you, he turns into an adult, and when he turns 21, he can no longer stay. He has to leave the country. So those are the types of restrictions that we're imposing on some of the highest skilled people in our economy, H-1B visa holders specifically. And other countries, Canada, Australia, have direct paths to permanent residence, even Germany, many European countries also. If you spend a few years in their country, you have a direct way to apply for permanent residence. Nothing like that in the U.S. Immigration system. At the low end of things, it's a similar dynamic, except we basically have a total ban on hiring people for year-round jobs in in positions that don't require a college degree. So unlike the H-1B visa holders, there's nothing like that at all for people in year-round industries where employers are in desperate need of workers. So instead, what we get is a bunch of people showing up at the border, requesting asylum. They go through this whole process. Some of them get work permits. Some of them are just banned from being employed. And that creates a huge barrier to entry into the labor force. And we're seeing a lot of those people get deported or leave the country because of those restrictions.
So I want to go back on a thread from, how we just went down the line around the assumption, correct assumption. I think that there are a lot of folks that for different reasons don't want to engage in certain jobs. And we mentioned some of them, I think teachers are another big one. I want to kind of come back, starting with you, because there's also this piece around a lot of the jobs that supposedly a lot of folks here don't want to do that immigrants do want to do. So I want to dig a little bit into that, and then coming back, talking through then what do you think we need to do to change the conditions, because we do need to fill those jobs. We need more teachers. We need nurses. So what can we do to create incentives or to shift that dynamic that critical jobs in our communities are going unfilled?
Yeah, very few jobs have a majority of the labor force who are immigrants. So it's definitely true that Americans will do basically any job. Some Americans, it's just the unemployed ones won't choose many of those jobs. And so that's the problem is it's the margin. You got to think, okay, well, how are we going to increase employment in this area or get more people attracted to this? And that's really, there are obviously ideas to get more Americans involved, but immigrants are going to be the main way for labor force growth, regardless of the type going forward. They're already accounting for all of the increase in the prime age, working age population. So it's going to be difficult to expand employment in many of these areas without any immigrants.
This reminds me of Jonathan earlier today talked about Officer Bob, who is a good police officer, and how we need more Officer Bobs. And I think that, as anyone here could point out, there's this sort of cultural shift that needs to take place where we might regard teachers or police officers differently than we currently do if we need more of them. But at the same time, I want to maybe push back a little bit on the notion that we necessarily need a growing workforce at this point, in the sense that we are now developing technologies that are capable of augmenting substantially or replacing large swaths of the labor force. And there are concerns now, not that we won't have enough workers, but that so many workers won't have jobs because we won't need them. And so it might be that we need to change the focus of what is actually the problem here.
I think that's a really good point. Some sectors that come to mind are sectors that are squeezed by guild dynamics. Teachers and childcare. A lot of people aren't allowed to work as teachers and childcare workers unless they do a bunch of tricky and usually expensive things. I can't go and be a teacher. I could go be a tutor, and usually for people over 18. There's a doctor shortage here. A lot of immigrants who, even if they've been doctors in Germany, don't actually have a straightforward path to being a doctor here. If they immigrated here and they've practiced medicine in Germany for 10 years, they generally have to redo their residency in order to be qualified to take an exam in order to practice medicine here. And so we have a situation where a lot of people don't want to be doctors in rural areas, and people have really, really long wait times to see a doctor, and we have a bunch of really well-trained immigrants from abroad who just, because of the way the medical boards are set up just straight up aren't allowed to practice here. You also see a shortage in psychology. Psychology is one of those so-called useless degrees, as per Preston's work.
I wouldn't use the word useless.
But it's really interesting where people, I have a psychology degree from Yale. I have a private coaching practice that's completely not based on my degree. It's just, hey, I'm doing this with you and you're giving me money to do some of this with you. Fantastic, we have an arrangement. But even something like being a low-level person, like at any clinic, I need to go through a bunch of more expensive hoops and in that specific state. So I move a lot. I moved like 4 times this past year. If I wanted to get certified to work at a clinic, or even for very low pay, or even if I wanted to volunteer, this isn't a thing I can do because of gatekeeping conditions within the Guild of Psychology. And a lot of nice people have tried to work on this by expanding certification beyond the state or online things, but even if you're an online psychologist, you have to go through a lot of regulations. And so these guild dynamics are definitely a factor where a lot of the reason there are shortages in certain fields, the way those shortages happened sometimes is through the guild dynamics that now are still existing that keep those shortages from being fixed. Where those guild pressures are still there. The problem that created the shortage is still impossible to go around.
I want to just briefly talk about teachers, since you mentioned teachers and you mentioned teachers, and this is one of the occupations that I think is most affected by this tendency towards degree inflation. Because right now, if you're a teacher and you only have a bachelor's degree, you have a major salary penalty relative to somebody who has a master's degree. And, you know, all of the economic evidence, the studies that have been done on this say that, you know, master's degrees don't really make teachers any more effective. We don't really see any difference in student performance between teachers who get a master's degree and teachers who only have a 4-year degree. I have a friend who's a teacher in Montgomery County, Maryland right now, and he's trying to get his master's degree in order to get this very significant pay bump that they offer in Maryland for teachers who get a master's degree. And I said, well, do you think your program is helping you become a better teacher? He said, yeah. And I said, is that because of anything you're learning? He said, no, it's just giving me more empathy for my students because I'm remembering what a miserable experience it is to be a student. So anyways, I mean, that's one area where I think that if we want to fix our teacher shortage, you know, one thing we could do is stop giving teachers such a major salary penalty if they don't get a master's degree, because if they want to get, you know, a family sustaining wage, they're going to have to get this other degree. That's a barrier that takes time. They might have to take on debt for that. You know, that's just a hoop that they have to jump through, which many of them are going to leave the profession rather than jump through. And so that seems like a very no-brainer. I won't say solution, but a way to address this problem we have, where we can't recruit enough teachers.
I'm going to open it up for questions in a second, but before I do that, I wanted to kind of pull out on one thread. I, again, come from this space as well, and one of the things that I also see, and you've kind of hit on it by talking about the different occupations and the different approaches that you all bring to the conversation, is that even in the way that government is structured, we tend to separate workforce as if it's some separate checkbox somewhere over there. And so part of it too is we have folks obviously in the audience that work on different issues, is, you know, thinking about workforce as a priority within all of the other strategies, right? So when you're thinking about how you're recruiting teachers, or when you're thinking about nursing, apprenticeship is not some random thing that lives over there. Immigration is not some random thing that lives separately in its own checkbox. And so thinking through how do we comprehensively think about those strategies, and are thinking through when we are building the thing, whether we're on the private sector side or on the policy side, how we're integrating workforce development into it. I think is something that I want to pull out because it feels like it's coming out into what you're all saying, but I did want to say that. So quickly before we head out to reception, are there any questions in the room? Any comments? Susana.
Thank you. Why should it be a problem that the government should be like solving, like the shortage of workforce, or what are we gonna do with the new jobs that are created? I mean, shouldn't it be just a matter of the private sector? I think that the role of the government should only be to open borders, so then the private companies can choose who they want to hire based on merit. For me, it's very strange that a private sector of a private company would think, oh, I need a teacher, and I'm going to make sure that this person has a bachelor's degree and multiple certification. It's only the government who is establishing all these limitations in the health sector, in education. So usually the private sector, what they want is to hire as many people as possible in order to grow their business. So yeah, I mean.
Well, I agree with you. My stance is exactly that. I think that employers should be able to hire whoever they want, regardless of where they are or where they were born, and that's our merit-based immigration reform.
I agree.
One thing related to that maybe you can dig a little bit into that we didn't ask, and before we close, is around how the pandemic affected some of that and opened up borders in some ways for employers to do that. Do you have any comments on that piece? And I mean hearing, because the pandemic forced a lot of folks into remote work, and what that means even for Americans working out of other countries, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, no, it's definitely true. We have a huge expat population working around the world, and we have the ability to hire people on a temporary basis if they're in another country. But if they come here and work in the U.S., all of a sudden we have all these licensing requirements and visa requirements that we impose on that work. So it's a huge problem. I would say, there are economic consequences to us prohibiting people from working here. And it's not that the government should solve all the problems in the economy that are created when there are fewer babies being born, but it shouldn't be exacerbating those problems by having government policy that gets in the way of people being productive.
Yeah. Any other questions? Final thoughts?
Oh yeah, real quick. So we've talked a lot about government inefficiency. I think a separate aspect of business inefficiency is that we have all these great technologies now that make it easy for lots of people to apply for jobs. And this can actually lead to some inefficiency in the sense that in the end, what workers and employers are doing is they're trying to find the best possible match. And when you make it super easy for people to apply for jobs and you get thousands and thousands of applications, and workers complain about this a lot because then they think they don't get a look. They have algorithms that look through them. And it's pretty hard for companies to find the right people as well. And so this is a different sort of inefficiency because companies, kind of feel like they have to use these systems in the same way that colleges do for the Common App. And so, I don't know. I think there's definitely a lot of stuff the government should get out of the way of, but also there's some business stuff that, practices that might need to be addressed a little bit.
It would be great because they have more options to choose from. They're going to choose the best of the best, and they are free to do so, right?
But there are information limitations. Like it's hard. If you are flooded with tens of thousands of candidates for something, then it can be harder to actually select the best person.
I'm not sure about that. I think it's just better if they have multiple options to choose from. But maybe this is
Okay.
Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say on the government intervention question, I would also say that when the government does intervene, and I think in most cases the government should not intervene, but when it does intervene, it should make sure it's not putting its thumb on the scales in favor of one thing over the other, like the fact that it's putting its thumb on the scales in favor of college over apprenticeships and workforce training right now. But yes, get the government out wherever possible. Shall we go drink?
Yep. Thank you.